Okay, good morning. My name is Gary Matsuoka, and we're here at Laguna Hills Nursery in Santa Ana. It's a Saturday morning, and it's a lovely day for once for once. We've got, and we're real happy because this time of year we've just received about 1,500 bare root fruit trees, and that gives us plenty of stuff that we can enjoy and sell. So this week's class will be talking about the fruit trees that usually sell out for us first. That would be jujubes and persimmons. On both of these trees, we used to have 3 bare root tree suppliers. 2 of the 3 went out of business in the last 10 years, so it's kind of cut our inventory down a bit. So we often sell out of these quickly, and they're becoming more popular. So jujube, which botanically is Ziziphus. I might have spelled that wrong. But these are not related to too many things. I mean, interestingly, they are related to the coffee berry bushes in California. So they do have a local relative. And jujubes are often called Chinese date because they kind of look like one. They're shaped typically about the same shape as a date. They're green when they're growing. As they mature, this becomes mahogany colored, kind of brownish, reddish colored. And if you haven't eaten one before, fresh off the tree, they're quite a bit like apples, except they're more tender. So they're crispy, but very tender. Not too juicy, but apples aren't either. And they do have an apple flavor, and they're usually, most of the varieties that we sell, 2 to 3 times sweeter than apples. So very, very sweet. Once they start to dry, they actually do resemble dried apples a lot, but again, much sweeter. They're from Asia. There are quite a few species. We do the Chinese jujube, which is native mostly to China and parts of India. There are other jujubes throughout that area. The trees are somewhat drought tolerant. Here's let me pull one out. So this is a bare root specimen of jujube. And if you look closely, you can see spines on them. So they're very spiny when they're young, especially, and as they get older, the spines, like when I first started growing jujubes, my kids were kind of young, so I cut off most of the spines, but we noticed that as the trees got older, they made fewer and fewer spines. You also notice that the branches tend to zigzag. Now, these are broken branches, but they tend to zigzag a bit. And that is one of the things that makes them pretty. This one, I just got it right out of our bundle of bare roots, so it hasn't been trimmed up yet. So normally when we plant jujubes, cut off all the broken branches. Now, the thing about jujubes that's a bit different is that they're one of the fruit trees that actually, a lot of the little branches die in the winter. So if you see dead branches on your jujube, small dead branches, that's totally normal. And the other thing that sets jujubes apart is that they can actually fruit on new growth. Whereas most fruit trees fruit on last year's wood, jujubes can grow back from a stump. So actually one year at my house, I had a 8-foot jujube tree that I wanted to see because I had read that they used the entire tree in Asia. They just use the entire tree. So they said that the typical jujube tree, say in Afghanistan, would make about 20 pounds of fruit. And they said a week after they harvested the fruit, they would strip all the foliage off and feed it to their cattle. Now, just so you know, jujube trees do drop their leaves fairly quickly after they fruit. So in the fall, they fruit in the fall, and within a month or so, the leaves are yellow and falling off. So they would have fallen off anyway, but they feed them to their cattle. And then in the wintertime, they cut them down to a 4-foot stump and make firewood out of the rest of the tree. So I wanted to see that. So I cut my tree down to about this height. And by July, it was back up over my head and flowering. So the nice thing about jujubes, if you want to size control them, no problem. You just cut them anywhere you want them to start the next year, and they'll put on about 5 or 6 foot of growth that year with branches and flowers and fruit. Now you'll probably get more fruit if you leave them a little bit bigger, but I wanted to see what that would do. And apparently in Afghanistan, they cut them down to 4-foot stumps just to use for firewood. Now, when we sell these for bare root, jujubes are a little touchy. Like this one didn't have much root. Most of the plants we're selling have much more root than that. So when we have that much root, I would cut off quite a bit of the top just to make sure that what we have left will sprout. Now, when we got them from the first company that was selling jujubes, they would cut off all the little spines on the trunk because they didn't want to handle them, and they would cut all the branching off. So we never knew that they came with branches until that company went out of business, and then the other company started growing them, and they left the spines on, left the spiny branches on, but you don't need that. If you cut all these off, they'll sprout anyway. So they're grafted. So this is one plant, and these are one of the more expensive plants because they don't do bud grafting, they do stem grafting. So like most fruit trees, persimmons included, they have the rootstock, and they just slide in one bud from a stem into the side of the rootstock. On this one, it doesn't work too well. So what they actually do is they have a 2-inch section of branch that they graft on top of the rootstock, which means they can't make as many. It takes them longer to bud these things, and they can't make as many because this little 2-inch piece has more than one bud on it. So it's more involved to graft jujubes than most citrus, although they do stem grafting on avocados, and I believe citrus use stems too. Oh, here's a broken root, so we'll trim that off also. So anyway, you just stick that in the ground. Now they need decent drainage, but they're not that sensitive. As long as you put them in real dirt or our top potting soil. I should have brought a bag over here. But you can keep them quite wet. I used to have this by my sprinkler valves at my last house. So many times I looked at it and there was water sitting there next to my jujube tree, and we had really bad clay soil. It was fine. It didn't have any problems with that. Now the plants are considered drought tolerant, and most fruit trees are to an extent, but they don't perform well if they're under drought stress. Normally these trees will grow 15 to 20 foot, maybe even taller, upwards, and then the branches kind of zigzag slightly as they come down, so quite attractive. The unattractive thing about jujubes is that they're bare a long time. Now they don't need chill, so the only fruit trees that we're coming across that absolutely need a cool winter are the stone fruits: apricots, apriums, cherries, peaches, plums, nectarines, pluots, and pleuries. Need the winter, else they don't develop flower buds well. Jujubes, we had a few winters where it was barely into the 50s and it got to the 40s, but we had 90 degrees in January on some of those winters, like 2014, 2015. And we noticed the jujubes woke up in January and are blooming by February. and making fruit. Whereas the last few years, real cool springs. Winter wasn't that cold, but the springs were very cool. They didn't wake up and start growing till May, and they would bloom in June, so very late. So they don't. So they just respond to temperature. 80 degrees gets them going as far as growth goes, and they'll stay dormant if it's cooler than that. They just won't grow. So they usually bloom June, earlier if it's warmer early, but June, July, they bloom over a several month period. They usually fruit over a several month period, starting, some years it'll be August, usually it's September, October. And then right after that, the leaves start turning yellow and falling off. So they can have a long dormant period where they're just naked. But it can also be short. So I would think if you lived in Palm Springs, it would be a very short dormant period, and they'll be green most of the year. Now, when these first came to us, they listed as being totally self-fertile. Now we know that not all of them are. The one thing about jujubes that's very common, so here we have the ground, and then the rootstock with the roots, and then the grafted part going up. And then, they grow about a foot, then they start to make little flowers. The flowers are only about a 1/4 inch in size, and they're not all that gorgeous. They're just kind of creamy green colored to creamy yellow colored. And there are some that are self-fertile, but a lot of them, I would say all of them are partially self-fertile, because when I took one home, it was making about 10 fruit per year, whereas the ones we had, collection of them at the nursery, and even the small trees are making more than 10 fruit. So I knew I needed a pollinator, so I took another tree home, put it next to it, and then it started making about 200, 300 fruit a year. So we know that not all of them are totally self-fertile. There are a few that are considered totally self-fertile, but not all of them are. Now, there's a way around having to have 2 trees. They do grow their roots from seedlings. So all the root stocks are genetically different. And the thing about jujubes that's very unique is that any sucker that comes out of either the lower trunk or the root system usually blooms along with the rest of the tree. And it's genetically different. So if you let the suckers bloom, it should be able to pollinate. If you allow at least one sucker to grow, it should be able to pollinate the top. And that's the other bad thing about jujubes, is that they do root sucker. So you can get, now it's not real fast or anything. So like I had them next to my lawn, so I would just mow them down. They are bad if you have a lot of bushes nearby. Then you have all these suckers growing through the bushes. It's hard to get rid of them. They do make, so the suckers usually make fruit too, and they usually are pea-sized fruit that are not as sweet, but I eat them anyway. I like them. They were kind of real tart, pea-sized to maybe, all these varieties were originally seedlings, so sometimes you'll get something bigger than a pea, but pea size is common. Fertilizer-wise, not that picky. We don't see much literature on what actually to fertilize them. In most of the developing countries where these are real popular, they would just use animal manures, dead leaves, things like that. And I didn't really fertilize mine that much. It fruited quite well without too much help. I mean, most mature fruit trees don't require that much fertilizer other than a good mulch on the ground. Citrus, we do fertilize heavily in the wintertime, but most of the other fruit trees don't need it once they get to size. mean, we do recommend the organic fertilizers or manures or compost of some sort. Now, they are very sensitive to composts underground, so make sure you don't use any planter mixes or potting soils that contain compost in them in the root zone. So if you put these in a pot, do not, most, I would say 95% of all the potting soils out there on the market contain compost, and that will ruin these trees. They just won't grow well. Our potting soil doesn't have compost. Just so you know what it looks like, it's mostly sand, sponge rock, and volcanic rock with some peat moss and charcoal. Nothing in there really decomposed at any rate. And you can grow both the persimmon trees and jujube trees quite well on it. Keep it real wet, it won't rot them. Yeah, that's the top potting soil that we created. It's what we grow all our persimmons and all our jujubes in. Both of them, well, the jujubes make pretty good container plants. The heat of the containers. So the one difference between containers and the ground is that containers usually are the same temperature minimum as the air. So they're colder than the ground in the wintertime, which is okay. We're not in a frost-prone area. If you were in Missouri and you had them in a container, it would kill them in the winter because the temperature in Missouri would drop down to probably below zero, and that would kill the roots. Whereas the soil on the ground usually stays above freezing. And in the summer, the soil temperature in the ground usually stays below 90 degrees, but in a pot, it'll be the same as the air, which can be too hot for some plants on real hot days. And the black plastic on top of that can get 140 degrees on the surface of that. So that can be too hot, but persimmons and jujubes don't seem to be as sensitive, although in most cases, they'll do better in wood, which is better insulated, than they will in black plastic, just so you know. But we don't seem to have much trouble with them in black plastic at the nursery, although we do keep our containers fairly close together, and the foliage does shade it in the summertime so that they're not getting the full brunt of the sun. And you can just cover the pots, paint them white. So there are several things you can do to keep black plastic cooler. Okay, so the varieties of jujubes. The original ones that were sent to the U.S. a long time ago were Lee and Lang. We don't grow Lang anymore. We used to. So Lee is a barrel-shaped jujube that's about that size, and Lang was a more narrow jujube about this size. We had trouble getting the Lang to be real sweet. The Lee, no problem. Lang, not as good, especially here near the coast. Inland, no problem. But near the coast, if we have too many cloudy days, the Lang didn't sweeten up for us very well, so we quit carrying that one. We do carry Chico, which is a real interesting one from Chico State. It's shaped, it's only one that's wider than tall. So it's shaped like an apple or a tomato or a flat persimmon. Fairly good size. It's probably actual size a little smaller, about like that. So it's smaller than Lee. And then there's GA 866. Now Chico's original number at Chico State was GI 227 or something like that. G866 never got a normal name, but it was real famous because at the time, back in the early 90s, late 80s, it was considered the sweetest one in their collection. And it's about that size and shape, over 20% sugar or whatnot. Now, lately we've gotten honey jar and sugar cane. And these are newer ones that are considered sweeter than G866. Honey jar seems to be the sweetest out there. I haven't seen a formal study on it though, but it's also the smallest. So honey jar is about that size. Sugar cane is about this size and shape. So, you know, total sugars in here may not exceed any of the other ones, but it's so small, marble-sized fruit, that it tastes sweeter, or it is sweeter. Now, all the jujubes have a seed in them, not a huge seed, in the middle. And then there's Shanxi Li, which is the last one we've gotten a hold of, Shanxi Li. And that's supposed to be the largest of all the jujubes, about 50% larger than Li. So Shanxi Li, we're not sure if these are totally different plants, because we looked up where Li is from in China. It's from the province of Shanxi. So whether these two might be identical, this one might just be a strain of it that's larger. We're not exactly sure what's going on there. And these were all cultivars developed in the United States. We've carried other ones in the past. We like Sherwood, but my suppliers, this current supplier doesn't carry it. Sherwood was developed in Texas. Sherwood was kind of nice because it did ripen distinctly later than the rest. So most of these overlap the ripening period, late summer, early fall. Sherwood was mid-fall, so it was definitely later, but I can't get that one anymore. And generally, except for the sweetness, you really can't tell the flavors apart that much. Any questions on the jujubes? So we do have, except for Lang, we have all these in stock, although we don't have too many of some of them. This is one where we're allocated, 10 or 15. Li we can get a lot of. In fact, the Li's came in the nicest. This is a Li here. We like to have stems that thick or thicker. The rest of them are more like finger thick to pencil thick, about this thick a trunk. And we do have, on the thinner ones, we can get some duds where they don't do well. We have some that we got that were about this thick when we got them, 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch. And 2 years later, they're still alive. They make about 3 or 4 leaves every year, and then they go back to sleep. So there are some duds out there. It's better to get bigger plants. Oh. Mm-hmm.
I have a mature jujube tree. Would I be able to cut that down to like and it'll grow back?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Any height above, you got to be above the graft area. But yeah, I was only like less than a foot above the grafter when I cut mine down. And it grew back and fruited that year just about as nice as I had the previous years I had it. So.
And I would do that like as soon as the leaves fall, or
no,
anytime?
Yeah, I mean, you can do it when the leaves fall. You can do it, right now. I did mine just before it woke up. I think it was already spring. It was a cool year, so because I had read that article, I just cut it down. I wanted to see. And I was amazed at what it could do. I would say, you know, leave the main trunk and some short branching is better than cutting it down all the way like I did. But that's still pretty amazing that you can do that with that plant. Okay. Dave Wilson did have another variety that was called, I think it was, that had more distinct zigzagging branches. I don't recall the name of it. But it was grown more for beauty than for fruit. So we don't carry that one. Okay, persimmons. Persimmons have gotten quite popular in the U.S. And unfortunately, there are different kinds of persimmons, and unless you know what's going on, you can be totally surprised and never buy one again. If you get so, persimmons are either non-astringent or astringent. Until dead ripe. Now, the literature describes astringent as bitter, but it's not bitter. I mean, when I eat a astringent persimmon, it's sweet, but it just dries your mouth out like crazy. It's just like, I don't know, is that what alcohol, pure alcohol does? But it's the tannins in the flesh. Tannins protect plants. They're chemicals that protect plants, and the tannins disappear as the fruit ripens. But the tannins in your mouth, it just, you know, it could be really juicy, and you put in your mouth, and suddenly your mouth feels like it's totally dry, and you can't talk, you can't swallow. It's really a strange sensation. So the majority of persimmons, especially in the past, were astringent until they were jelly ripe. Non-astringent persimmons appeared relatively recent. I was looking at the literature, and they said just maybe 100, 200 years ago, they suddenly found non-astringent persimmons that you can eat when they were hard with no astringency noted. So that's something unique. And most of the non-astringent persimmons are the ones that are shaped like a tomato. And most of the astringent ones are shaped like an acorn. So, but there are some, you know, it's not total, but generally if you buy one in the supermarket shaped like this, it's not astringent. If you buy one like that, you have to wait till it's dead ripe. Now, dead ripe means that it's softer than an avocado, softer than a pear. It's interesting. It's not like jam because it still has structure. It still has structure to it, but it's very soft. So now, what's interesting too is there are ways you can make these non-astringent without. So normally what you would do is you just sit the fruit down, you know, like the hot chia persimmons, which are shaped like chocolate persimmon. This is a chocolate persimmon. You just set them on their stem end and leave them there until they're, we do this because if they're on contact like this, sometimes they rot there. So you leave them on their stem and just let them sit there until they're really, really soft, and then you eat them. But there are ways to make this non-astringent much quicker. Now in the deep south, so persimmons are interesting. They're native to almost every continent out there. And in the deep south, the American persimmons, oh, I forgot the botanical name. Diospyros. Diospyros virginiana is the American persimmon. Diospyros kaku is kaki is the Japanese persimmon, which these are. They say leave them on the tree till the second frost. So putting these in the freezer, letting them thaw. If you want to make sure you do it twice, freeze them, let them thaw, freeze them, let them thaw. It must do something to the cells inside, bursts the cells, the ice crystals, and it makes them non-astringent. But in Japan, the original method was put a astringent persimmon inside of an empty sake keg. The ethanol. So one of my friends, older friends, told me, Ziploc bag, a drop of whiskey or vodka in there, zip them up overnight, they would be non-astringent. The other method, they said, is put them in microwave. Heat them up, and then they're non-astringent, or dip them in boiling water for a few moments, and they'll become non-astringent. So those are methods. Now, there are some that are not astringent if they develop seeds. So this chocolate persimmon always pretty much has seeds in it. And so this is a variant where if the plant has seeds in the fruit is non-astringent. And you can come up and try this afterwards if you want. It's not astringent, even though it's still fairly firm. It's very edible. And then there's others that if they don't make seeds, you can never eat them. And I've had some of those too, so we'll go over some of those. So now the non-astringent, well, we'll talk about that when we get to the varieties. Now, persimmons, generally, these are all grafted trees. Most of them are quite precocious. You often get fruit. Now, the trees are 2 years old when we get them, or a year and a half since they were grafted when we get them. So this one, at 2 years of age, it was flowering. Now this one this is a weird tree. I saved it because I wanted to see if it was actually going to make fruit, because this one, normally they bloom in April or May, and the fruit ripens in the fall. This tree here had a growth spurt from here to the end of the branches in August, and it was blooming in August and making fruit. I'm going, that's like 3 months too late, but the fruit made it. It's not as big as it should be. So this fruit normally would be about an inch or two longer and bigger, but I'm still surprised that it made edible fruit that late. Well, it can't be that surprised because apples do it too. Sometimes they bloom in the fall and you'll get fruit this big and they taste fine. They're just small. So, and the one nice thing about having an astringent persimmon in your garden, if you grow the non-astringent ones, have one astringent one in your garden, the birds and the animals go, God, I can't eat that stuff. And then they start leaving it alone because they taste one of the astringent ones. And then, so you see a lot of persimmons in November full of fruit. Nothing's eating them. So, because most of the animals that eat them don't like the astringency either. Okay, persimmons aren't speed burners. The trees can grow big, but it takes them a long time. So figure a lot of trees, you'll get 1 to 2 foot a year. This one actually grew about 3 foot this year, which is very unusual to have that second growth spurt. But usually we keep them around 8 foot by 8 foot, or I had a tree that was so heavy producer, it never got above 5. It was just always loaded to the ground. I mean, I should have been good to the tree and took off some of the fruit so it could grow, but I really like persimmons, so I just let it fruit, and it never got much above 5 foot in height. So generally, you don't have to worry about them getting too big. They do like good drainage. So I have had problems in a spot in my yard that was essentially a pond in the winter, and they kind of just pooped out there. They didn't die, but they just wouldn't grow there. So I put them in a spot in clay that was a little better draining, and they were fine. They were fine. I had clay soil at my last house, and didn't kill them, but they just wouldn't grow in the waterlogged clay. So watch that. Good in containers. We grew one in a 24-inch box once, and it had, it's just the second year it had over 60 fruit on it. The fruit, the value of the fruit was actually more than the value of the tree. It was just crazy how much fruit was on that tree. So they can fruit very heavily in containers. Most of the persimmons we sell do not need a pollinator. It's actually only one we sell that actually does. So they're they make fruit without having seeds. So, except for the two that require seeds to get non-astringent. They make two kinds of flowers, male and female, although this variety called chocolate is the only one I've ever seen male flowers on. This little stalk here that's dead was a male flower stalk, whereas the female flowers are usually larger, like 5 times bigger than the male flowers, and are attached right to the main stems. So those stems don't die, but where the male flowers are attached, the stems just shrivel up after the flowers are gone. So you can kind of tell which is male and female. The males come in clusters, the females are spaced out on the stem. Now, there was a large persimmon orchard for many, many years down in San Juan Capistrano, and a few of the trees are still there. That's the Bathgate orchard. And they learned a lot about pruning, or they wrote a lot of articles about pruning persimmons. And they noted that if a persimmon has a real heavy crop, sometimes the next year the tree won't have much fruit on it at all, or no fruit. And then on a year when the tree has no fruit, the next year it's overloaded. So they can get into that alternate bearing pattern where too much fruit one year, nothing the next. So what they said they would do is on a year when the tree had no fruit and you had this much growth that came out, they would cut it back by 2/3 because they didn't want to make that much fruit the next year. They just wanted 2 per branch is about right on a persimmon tree, rather than having 10 on the branch, and then you wouldn't have any energy to make fruit the following year. So on a year when they had no fruit, they cut the branches back, the new growth back. And on the years when they had a huge crop, they wouldn't touch it. So, and that's about all. I mean, the trees will slowly reach 20 foot, 30 foot in height, but it takes them decades, if not generations, to get that big. So, because there are some really big persimmon trees out there, but they're really old, like planted in the 40s or 50s. So, now their wood is very strong. Their Diospyros ebanaster is ebony. But they do say that the trees have to be 100 years old before they develop the black wood in the center. The heartwood of a persimmon tree, a really old persimmon tree, will be really dark because the new wood is kind of yellowish. Now the roots on persimmons are black. So this is persimmon roots, and they're very dark. This still got a little mud on it, but they're very dark. And the one thing they do say about persimmons, do not expose the black roots to sun because they'll burn severely. So make sure you plant them deep. So they always say plant them up to the bud union, just to make sure you don't let any of the roots get exposed to light, because they burn very, very easily. And generally with most fruit trees like this one, it doesn't have any branches. Well, if you just plant it like this, the branches will start up here. So we usually cut them down to the height we want them to branch at, which I usually like them to branch around 30 inches above the ground. So we cut them down, but you know, a lot of times for our customers, we'll give them the option. So we'll leave it maybe 4 foot, which is still kind of high off the ground. This one's about a foot above the ground here. But so when you plant it, it'll be right about here. But again, your option, you can cut it down a little farther to get your branching started lower, so you don't have to climb a ladder to pick your fruit. And you can even cut it down there if you want. Most commercial orchards, if they have a tree like this, they'll cut it down to here. 1.5 feet is common on many fruiting orchards because they just don't want to climb ladders, and they don't care what it looks like. Okay, now both persimmons and jujubes, we generally don't spray for anything. There's very few critters that go after them. Now, if you have a lot of ants around you can get scale on both. And for scale, we'd use an oil spray, something like that. But I don't know that I've ever sprayed persimmons or jujubes for anything, so they don't seem to get mildew near the coast or anything like that. Now, jujubes are sweeter the warmer the weather is, so the further inland you go, the sweeter they get. Persimmons doesn't seem to be a problem anywhere. And they don't need a chill. They don't have a chill requirement either. So when we had those real hot winters, we saw these waking up in January also, just like the jujubes. They woke up in January instead of normally, which is around March or April, they would wake up. Okay, the varieties. Or more properly, the cultivars. Well, the one that we sell the most of easily is called the Fuyu, but that cultivar is no longer being sold. So the original Fuyu, and I remember when I was a kid, back in the 50s, when I would eat them, they weren't as flat as they are today. So the original Fuyu were about this size and shape, and they usually had 2 or 3 seeds in them. Not fully developed seeds, but they usually had some slivers of seeds in them. I remember that. So that's the original Fuyu, but it's not sold anymore. The newer versions, and we have several. We have Emoto, Izu, and Jiro. And there's also another one called Giant. So the most common of these is the Jiro, or Jiro, which is the one that's grown mostly commercial. So this is the main commercial one, but Emoto is also a commercial variety. So this is the main one though. Now, I used to grow both of these in the 1980s, and my dad and I would have taste tests, and interestingly, we would always choose Emoto. Well, it turns out that they're genetically identical. Emoto ripens 2 weeks before Jiro. So we liked Emoto better because it was 2 weeks riper. The texture was better because it was, so this one would still be somewhat crispy. If you eat them at the same time, more crispy, and this would be more, the texture would be a little more cheesy. So a little bit less crispy. and also probably a little sweeter because it was a little riper. So we always chose this one, but we found out that Emoto is a sport of Juro, just an early sport of Juro. So they're pretty much genetically identical. Although Emoto over the years also seems to be a little more precocious. Like my Emoto, when it was this big, first year 2 fruit, second year 25 fruit, third year 75. And during those 3 years, the Juro next to it grew and grew and grew without making fruit. On its 4th year, though, the Juro had about 100 fruit on it, and the Emoto never made that many because it was so small. So, but the fruit is hard to tell apart. They're larger than Fuyus, and they're flatter, and no seeds. So, and the ones I see in the store are really small. That I see usually are real small. I think they, on older trees, they must let them fruit way too heavily, so the fruit size is smaller. Now, giant, in Japan, they're not called giant. They have different names. The one we're selling right now, the Japanese name for it is Gosho, and it's not as flat, but it's definitely bigger. More like that. They're good too. They're a little bit less acidic. So to me, a little bit blander, but still really, really good. The thing to know about this plant, though, the plants seem to be slightly weaker. We sometimes lose them. And young trees tend to abort their crop, which just drove me nuts. So I like the giant Fuyus. I planted 2 of them in my yard. And on their 3rd year, they're making, they had 50, 60 fruit that got that big, and it dropped all but 1 on each tree. They end up with 1 big fruit in the fall. It was right at the end of summer. In September, they had, covered with fruit this big, and all of them fell off. And it did that for 3 years, and I just couldn't stand it. I cut both trees down. I said, this is stupid. Then a friend of mine who has one that was 10 years older says, no, after about 5 years, they hold on. But boy, it just drives you nuts when they do that, when they abort their crop. So, and the literature says that Gosho is very commonly aborts its entire crop when they're young. So just be aware of that. There's nothing you can do. Now there's another giant Fuyu that's called Hana. And they said this one doesn't abort its crop. The problem is we couldn't get any trees to live. The trees don't bear root very well. They're not very good bare root specimens. So we got Hana for a few years and we gave up. We said none of these trees are growing. They're coming to us dead. So Gosho went back to Gosho. But just be aware when the trees are young, they abort. Now Izu is unique in that it is a smaller fruit, but it ripens way before the rest. So Emoto is September, October, and Juro is pretty much October into November. Gosho is more like the same as that, October, well, I'd say November. And the Izu, August into September. So the first time I grew Izu, the fruit started turning orange in July. I'm going, God, this thing is early. It was turning orange in July. It's also a smaller tree and it's also weaker. So last year, the trees came in looking so bad. We sold the biggest ones, but we held back most of them, and a lot of them didn't wake up. So definitely, if you buy, well, we guarantee the bare roots. So if you have one and you buy one and it doesn't, so most persimmons, when they first wake up, they'll put on a few leaves, but that doesn't guarantee anything. If they put on a foot of growth, then you're good, especially if the leaves get big. So a lot of times the izus will wake up and they'll make leaves this big and that's it. And you go, okay, I don't know about this one. But once they make leaves that are that big, then they've got a root system that's actively growing and good. So we held back a bunch of them last year, and then one of them started taking off with the bigger leaves. So we'll probably sell that one this year. But the trees came in looking better this year. So we'll see how it goes. Came with more size. Okay, so these are all the non-astringent. So the astringent ones, so we don't have this one, but we have all those. Now, just so you know, the company hasn't sent me signs, big signs for all these, so they're out there. I don't think this one doesn't have a sign on it, and this one doesn't have a sign. So, but they have their little tags on them, and they have the prices on the display below them. Okay, so the astringent ones and the ones that are seedy. So the ones that you can't eat until they're dead ripe, hachia and saijo. Hachia is the one you see in the supermarkets that's big and acorn shaped. Saijo is a lot smaller, similar shape. This is considered the sweetest, but again, I think it's because it's small. The smaller fruit tends to be sweeter than the bigger fruit. I mean, hachia is plenty sweet. Now, the one advantage of hachia, or the one thing about hachia that makes it desirable, is when you dry them properly. I mean, this is one of the best treats you'll ever have. Someone just gave me this, and it's got a Ziploc that, there it goes. So they peel off the skin and dry them intact. And it is, I mean, in Japan, it's considered the finest quality dessert you can ever have. It is really good. It is really good. So if you want to try a piece of that, there's some. Now, usually when I get them, that's one of our customers did this. When you get them at a Japanese food store, they're usually a little browner colored. But what they do is they'll take the fruit off when it's orange and cut up off with a piece of stem like this. And they use the stem, they hang it on the side of a barn door or the side of a barn. So it's under protection. They peel off the skin with the peeler and let it hang there. And every week they go out and massage it once a week to keep it from hardening. And it kind of squeezes some of the juice out of it. And then the juice turns into white crystals all over the outside. So just sugar crystals all over the outside of the skin. So once a week they massage it. They sell the dried stuff for like, I don't know what it is nowadays, $30 a pound or it's expensive because of all the work they do, but they make a lot of money that way too. but it's called hoshigaki, and it is like the food of the gods. It is really really nice to eat. So that's one reason to grow hot chia. And the guy told me, he says, that's why I grow it, because we can do this with it.
So Gary, there's a farmer at the Orange Farmers Market that sells a lot of persimmons and a lot of other things, but they also sell the
Dried?
what we're talking about, the ripened ones, and they have a little bowl. You can taste a little 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch piece. It's really good.
Yeah, it is one of the finest tasting things you'll ever have.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the hot chia and the saijo. You can leave them on a tree for a long time. The birds just don't go after those things. And then the ones that are seedy, this is the chocolate persimmon. You can eat this firm. So if they're making seeds, you can eat them firm. It's kind of brownish inside. There's a slight hint of cocoa in it. I mean, it's not, I mean, cinnamons in general have kind of a cinnamon, I mean, persimmons in general have kind of a cinnamon spicy flavor or pumpkin-like flavor. And this one may be a hint of chocolate taste. So, and usually the chocolate persimmons, again, if it's a normal crop, the fruit will be about that big, not this size. So you have the chocolate, which is self-fertile because it makes a whole bunch of male flowers and some female flowers. And then we have the coffee cake. So coffee cake is so chocolate is shaped like an acorn. The coffee cake is shaped a little flatter, kind of like a fuyu type. And if it's not pollinated, it tends to be inedible. I mean, they're big, they're nice big fruit, but if there's no pollinator around, you can't eat the fruit. So I planted one of these at my last house without, my chocolate had died. I just left the coffee cake in, thinking that one of my other persimmons would make at least a few male flowers, but they didn't. The fuyu types just don't make male flowers. The Jiro and the Emoto I had didn't make any male flowers. So I had a tree that had like 90 fruit on it, all this size, and I left them on the tree till they just fell off, and they never softened. They were just like rubber. I tried freezing some, they're still rubber. So if they don't get seeds and if they're not pollinated, almost just, now there might be another trick that I didn't do. Maybe I have to put alcohol on them or put them in the microwave, but I just couldn't eat those. So the coffee cake, which has some brown swirls in it when it has seeds, quite good when it is got seeds, but pretty much inedible if you don't have a chocolate persimmon tree nearby. So chocolate and coffee have to be, well, again, you need to be pollinated. Okay, any questions?
About pruning,
Mm-hmm.
I have a fuyu that I bought here 3 years ago, and it did really well. This past season, it had probably 30 fruit on it, but I want to keep it small enough so I can need a ladder. So the example that you have there, what would you do to that to keep it?
Well, you need to keep some 1-year-old. So 1-year-old growth makes the flowers and fruit. Now on this particular plant here, the original tree that we got a year ago was up to here. And all this is 1-year-old growth that had leaves on it. So you can cut it all the way back to here and you'll still get flowers all along the stem. But yeah, you have to save some 1-year-old branches. Shape-wise, if the tree's not that big, then all these branches are real healthy and should make fruit.
Right.
But yeah, you
cut off that sheer leader at the top there. it's just going to branch out to the side.
Right. If I don't cut this, it'll just grow upwards even higher. So it might be kind of high. So yeah. Yeah, so you might want to trim it back, but just make sure you have enough 1-year-old growth. This tree is, most of it is 1-year-old growth, so I can cut off a lot of it, still get a lot of fruit next year. This is weird though, because this, how did that work? Okay, so they're like, okay. So what it must be is that the branches that grow off of 1-year-old growth make flowers and fruit. That's what mulberries do. So mulberries and figs, you don't need to save much branch, but as long as the growth that's coming off the 1-year-old growth will then flower and fruit as it grows. So that must be what's happening with persimmons too. So you can actually cut it way back, and the branches that grow off of this 1-year-old growth will develop flowers and fruit. So you can cut it quite a bit. Because this grew without any flowers, fruit, but then this grew off of that and it bloomed. So this was acting like a 1-year-old branch when this one came out. Kind of unusual. All right.